Good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's Meeting of the Minds webinar on how cities can use real-time information from mobility operators to optimize city streets. During each webinar, we take a reading on who's joined us, so you'll see a poll pop up right now asking which sector best defines you. Please answer the poll and let us know who's in the webinar with us. My name is Jessie Feller-Hahn. I'm Executive Director of Meeting of the Minds. As many of you know, Meeting of the Minds is a global thought leadership network and platform for knowledge sharing with year-round digital and in-person programming. We connect global urban sustainability, innovation, and technology leaders across sectors to share best practices, tools, and solutions through our blog, our monthly webinar series, and more than 20 events each year. You can find all of our upcoming events, including webinars, in the events section of our website at meetingoftheminds.org. A few housekeeping notes to begin. Because of our very, very large audience in attendance today, you will remain muted throughout the event. Today's slides and a recording of today's webinar will be available on our website in the archive section on the top right-hand corner after the event for you to share with colleagues that couldn't make it today. You can also find today's presentations as PDFs in the handout section in the control panel, which you can already download now. That's at the bottom of your control panel on the right of your screen. The PDFs will also be available in the archive section on the page for the webinar on the website. We will have a Q&A during the second half of the hour. When you have a question, please type them into the questions panel in your attendee control panel as you think of them. So we're going to look at the poll results. We have about 53% private sector, a quarter public sector, great, and a mix of nonprofit and academics. Thanks so much, you guys, for answering that. That's helpful for our presenters. We would appreciate your input regarding today's webinar, so a short survey will pop up when you close your browser at the end of the event. We have two presenters today. I'm pleased to introduce them. Regina is the CEO and co-founder of Populous, a mobility data platform for cities and private operators to deliver safe, equitable, and efficient streets through better data. Regina has over a decade of experience in transportation, building software to simulate the future of cities. Populous works with cities from coast to coast to access new mobility data from shared bikes, scooters, and cars for transportation policy and planning. She's joined by Don McKenzie, who leads the Sustainable Transportation Lab at the University of Washington, where he is an assistant professor of civil and environmental engineering. With sponsorship from the automotive industry and federal, state, and local government, the lab develops and evaluates technical and policy solutions for making our transportation system more economically vibrant and environmentally benign, while providing access to opportunities for all. Current research includes charging behavior and infrastructure design for electric vehicles, the effects of vehicle automation on travel and energy demand, and the social impacts of emerging mobility services. So first, we're going to hear from Don. Don, take it away.
Great. Thank you very much, Jessie. And thank you all for joining today. I've titled my talk, Applying Public Data to Make Mobility More Efficient and Equitable. And before I get into that, I thought I'd just start by briefly introducing the Sustainable Transportation Lab. We're a group within the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department at the UW in Seattle. We have a great team of undergraduate, graduate, and postdocs from around the country and around the world, and it's really there to them that the credit goes for any of the work that I'm able to share today. And so in our lab, we define sustainability broadly. It's not just an environmental issue in our view. It's also about supporting a vibrant economy and ensuring equitable access to opportunities for everyone. And we see these outcomes as being driven not just by technology. So although we're in an engineering department, we're not just about technology. We're really interested in how how individual behaviors interact with that technology and how that's mediated by public policy in order to drive these sustainability outcomes. And so with that said, I thought I'd provide a little bit of context or background, and that's really what's motivating this webinar today is the revolution in transportation data. Now, I don't have data on the data. What I have here is kind of a qualitative, hand-wavy depiction, kind of my view of the world. So traditionally, there was not a lot of data on the transportation system, but what data there was pretty much equitably available to everyone. So whether you're a private company, a government, or a researcher, or someone in a public interest organization, the general public, pretty much everyone could get their hands on the same data. But again, it was pretty sparse. And what we're seeing now is that there's this vast new amount of data that's coming online, but it's largely concentrated in private hands, in private companies. And so, if anything, governments and the general public, in fact, have less access to this data than they did to traditional data. So what we're seeing governments do, and again, this is my perspective, this is how I see things playing out at the moment, is that governments are pressing companies to disclose and report more data, but most of that is about reporting those data to governments, especially local governments. And so my argument would be, yes, that to a certain degree this is important, but what I would prefer to see, and this is, I don't think, entirely self-serving, what I'd prefer to see is a greater effort to get some of that data out there to everyone. And that doesn't necessarily mean everyone, but to public interest organizations, to researchers, to think tanks, to other stakeholders who stand to benefit from that data. And my sense is that government is getting a lot more data into government, and that's important, but that there are things and questions that can be asked that arise outside of government and regulatory bodies, and getting a little bit more data out to everyone is helpful to answer those questions. And so what I want to kind of share today are examples of two case studies of work we've done in our lab where we used public or semi-public data from new mobility providers' APIs in order to answer questions that we felt were of public interest. And this is the idea here is these are things that we could not have done without access to that data, and we believe that there are probably many more ideas out there, questions that could be asked not just by regulators and local policymakers, but again other researchers, those in public interest, the nonprofit field, and so on. So the first example that I want to share today is some work we did looking at whether Car2Go, the free float car sharing service Car2Go, is complementing or competing with public transit. And this is work I want to acknowledge the students who worked on this with me. So the first cut here is that, we looked at Car2Go trips, every Car2Go trip over a period of several months in the Seattle area. And one thing you see here on the right, we see Car2Go trips, the start time of Car2Go trips. And the left two charts, we see the start times of public transit trips. And so you see that the general shape of these demand profiles is pretty similar, but a key difference is here in the early morning hours. You see there's a non-trivial number of Car2Go trips starting in the early morning hours, especially on weekends when transit service is really sparse. So in that sense, we can see that Car2Go is filling some gaps in late night service. But the main thrust of this work was to look at that basically whether Car2Go trips were being disproportionately used to serve routes, origins, and destinations that are poorly served by transit. And so this is one way of analyzing whether Car2Go is a complement to transit. Is it being used to fill in gaps where transit service is really poor? And what we argue is that if it is, then we would expect Car2Go to offer a disproportionately large time savings on those trips. So basically what we ask here is Car2Go being used for trips where it offers an especially large time savings relative to public transit? And so the way we did this, we started by scraping the Car2Go API for available vehicles every 30 seconds. So from that, we're able to get vehicle IDs. And by comparing the list of all available vehicles every 30 seconds, we can identify when a trip starts and when a trip ends, because we see a car disappear from being available to being unavailable. So we know that it's no longer available when we identify that as a trip start. We can also identify the lat and lon, so we can get the origins and destinations of trips. We can get the vehicle condition and fuel level. Those are reported through the API, and based on that, we can screen out what we call maintenance trips. So when Car2Go or one of their contractors comes out to clean a vehicle and fuel it up, we see the vehicle condition improve, the fuel level go up. We're not really interested in those maintenance trips. We're interested in the behavior of users, of customers, so we screen out those trips. We also screen out trips where the total travel time is greater than the sort of the worst case travel time plus 30 minutes. So what we mean there is we look at the origin and destination and the time of day, and we get sort of the pessimistic or worst case travel time for that trip from Google Maps, from a Google Maps API. We add 30 minutes to that to account for the fact that you can book that Car2Go up to 30 minutes ahead. And so what we say is if you're making a trip from A to B, it really shouldn't take you any longer than that worst case travel time plus 30 minutes for pre-booking. And so when we see a car that's unavailable for more than that time, we conclude that there's some intermediate stop in there, and that's not really what we're interested in this work. We also eliminated very short trips where we think that people wouldn't really be taking transit, they'd most likely be walking. And the result was 270,000 trips in our cleaned data set. And so for each of these trips, we have an observed trip start time when that car disappears from the API, and an observed trip end time when it reappears. And the challenge is there's a bunch of separate steps that happen in there. There's people can pre-book that car up to 30 minutes before it starts. They can they spend some time walking to reach the car, and that time may overlap with that pre-booking time. There's the time actually driving the car from origin to destination, and then there may be some parking search time at the end of the trip. So what we tried to do here was to decompose this and come up with estimates of these different components of the trip time. And so our driving time we retrieved from the Google Distance Matrix API. We estimated fixed effects. So we used a linear regression model here. We estimated fixed effects for the destination. We interpret those as the parking search time at the destination. And we also estimated origin coefficients. So based on the origin zone, the starting zone of the trip, we estimate an average amount of time associated with that. We interpret that as the sum of the booking time and the walking time, that pre-booking time and the walking time. And we then try to estimate walking time by looking at the locations of all the other available Car2Go vehicles. So we see a car, perhaps it's the car indicated by this red point here in the shaded polygon A. And then we look at the locations. Each of these blue dots represents the location of a nearby car that's close to A. And what we do here is we define this polygon. It's called a Thiessen polygon, and that is the region in which A is the closest car. And so knowing that A is the closest car, we assume that people choose the closest car. And then from that, we can calculate the expected walking time to reach the car, assuming that people have an equal probability of starting anywhere in that zone. And so in that way, we're able to estimate an expected walking time to reach car A. We're able to identify the distribution of pre-booking and walking times across all of our origin zones, and those average about 8 minutes citywide. And then the parking search time, we believe, averages about 3 minutes citywide, but you see it ranges from close to 0 up to about 6 or 7 minutes, as you see here. And then at the end of the day, this is kind of the central part of our analysis. So starting over here in the left column, we have these trips that were made by Car2Go, and we see that they include an average of 6.2 minutes of walking time, 17.8 minutes of driving time, for a total of 24 minutes. Now, if we made that same trip by transit based on the Google Transit Directions API, we would see about 9.2 minutes of walking time and 33.7 minutes of in-vehicle time plus transfer time, for a total of about 43 minutes. The third column here is sort of a pessimistic transit case where we also count the time that you have to wait before you leave your origin point, because transit service is schedule-based. You sometimes have to wait before you can even walk to the bus stop. So we have sort of an upper and a lower bound of the transit travel time. And what you see here at the bottom is that there's about a 44 to 64% time savings by using Car2Go relative to transit. Now, what we wanted to do was compare that against trips that were actually made by transit. So we looked on the right side panel here. These are trips that were actually made by transit. And what we see here is that the average is 42 to 70 minutes. But if the customers had made those trips by Car2Go, it would have taken about 22 minutes. So that's about a 46 to 68% savings. So the takeaway here the key here is that 44 and that 46 are pretty similar. That 64 and that 68 are quite similar. So what we don't see that the Car2Go trips have an especially large time savings relative to transit. So in this sense, we conclude that they're not really complementary in that regard. They seem to be just more operating as a direct substitute in this case. And we can also, out of this, identify a value of travel time that, or Car2Go users are paying about $23 per hour of travel time saved based on the difference in fares. So the second case study that I want to share has to do with UberX Service and looking at whether UberX is providing equitable service based on the socio-demographic characteristics of neighborhoods. This is work done with Ryan Hughes, who graduated back in 2015. And so the central question here is are Uber and Lyft drivers discriminating against passengers based on race and gender? There's a broader set of work that we've done where we look at this idea that you can there are multiple opportunities for discrimination, whether drivers decline requests, whether they actually transport people on the shortest and most cost-effective route, whether they give a tip or a star rating. So there's all these other issues, but we're specifically focused in this before the ride. So basically, what neighborhoods are drivers serving? Are they choosing to equitably serve different neighborhoods? So what we did was we mapped out, we observed about 1 million observations of UberX waiting times from Uber's API from May to July of 2015, all throughout their, at the time, current Seattle area service territory. We observed these about every 4 seconds over a 2-month period to collect this 1 million observations. And then what we did was we essentially analyzed how those waiting times correlate with neighborhood characteristics. So what you see here, this is a map of the Seattle region. We have the number 1 here is downtown. Number 2 is sort of a wealthier, wider North Seattle. Down here, 7, South Seattle tends to have more lower income. Mercer Island, this 4 here is Bellevue. This is the so-called east side. Anyways, we looked at population density. We looked at employment density. We looked at the fraction of minorities living in a census block group and the average income of the block group. And what we did was we used a spatial error regression model to test whether density, income, and the prevalence of minorities in a neighborhood affected the average waiting time to get an Uber. And what we found here, we estimated a separate model for each hour of the day. And so what we found is these effects varied throughout the day. But what you see here for population density, the coefficients, the effects vary throughout the day, but they're uniformly negative. So that means areas with higher density have shorter waiting times. That's hopefully not surprising to anyone on the call. We also see a similar negative relationship between employment density and waiting time. Incidentally, the pink shaded area are the 95% confidence bounds for the estimated parameters. So here what we see again, throughout most of the day, there's a significant negative relationship between employment density and waiting time. So areas with more jobs tend to have shorter waiting times. After controlling for that, this is kind of interesting. What we see here on the right panel, this is the easier one to explain. That's a positive coefficient. So what that means is areas with higher income tend to have longer waits to get an UberX vehicle after adjusting for the effects of density and fraction of minorities in a region. And that effect is robust throughout the day. The left side here shows that shows a little more complicated picture with the minority population fraction. This shows that basically in the late night, early morning hours, neighborhoods with more minorities will tend to wait longer to get an UberX, but in the morning rush hour and midday, they will tend to wait a shorter amount of time to get an UberX. So there's this sort of time varying effect of the fraction of minorities. And so that's really the summary of that work. Again, this is data we got from the Uber API. And so kind of the takeaway here is, my view would be that, API data can help to democratize research in a sense and allow for oversight of transportation markets. Access to existing APIs is relatively costless to provide. And we don't necessarily need, as analysts or researchers, we don't necessarily need all the data in order to make sound decisions. But a big challenge with API data is that they're subject to terms of use set by private companies. So the access is a challenge, and it can be withdrawn at any time at the whim of the company. There are commonly restrictions on aggregating and saving data, and those are serious barriers to research. And so, in my view, at a minimum, more generous access to APIs ought to be, a condition of market access in order to kind of legitimize and democratize the use of this data in oversight. And I will stop there and hand things over to Regina. Thank you very much.
Great to be here. Thank you so much, Dawn, and thanks to Meeting of the Minds for having us on this webinar. So my name is Regina. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Populous, a mobility data platform that is now partnering with cities from coast to coast to help them harness new sources of data to manage the future of mobility. Shared mobility has really rapidly evolved over the last 20 years. The co-founder of Populous and our CTO and myself were actually developing the software for the Bay Area Regional Transportation Agency to simulate the future of Bay Area travel back in 2012 and 2013. Software that the regional agency uses to evaluate fairly important policy and infrastructure investment decisions over a long period of time. And it was actually back then that we started to recognize that shared mobility services were growing very quickly. And problematically, in our roles back then as transportation forecasters for the Bay Area region, we had zero information about new mobility solutions, highlighting some of the key issues that Dawn also mentioned about the imbalance of data between the private and the public sector. As a research scientist at UC Berkeley back then, I started collecting data on the adoption and use of mobility services back in 2012, including car sharing, ride hailing services like Uber and Lyft, bike sharing, and in 2018, electric scooter sharing. And we've done so since then in major metropolitan areas, mostly in the United States. And what we've seen is that as new mobility services continue to evolve, their adoption has also accelerated. This is a chart from a July report we produced last year called the Micromobility Revolution, which is now officially, as of last week, a peer-reviewed TRB paper. And one of the key findings is that the adoption of shared mobility services has actually been accelerating due in large part to the mass proliferation of GPS-enabled smartphones. What's perhaps more exciting from a public agency perspective and from a researcher perspective, perhaps, is that there's been a major paradigm shift in the last year whereby cities have started to decide that if new mobility companies want to operate in the public right-of-way, or perhaps more importantly, park in the public right-of-way, they need to share data so that cities can measure progress towards public goals, which typically include safety, equity, and efficiency. And in the next few slides, I'm really going to focus on a few exciting examples of how cities are now harnessing that real-time data from operators to begin improving the efficiency of transportation systems in cities. Populous is working with cities from coast to coast in the United States who are able to access real-time data from mobility operators to help them use it for transportation policy and planning. We are ingesting APIs from multiple mobility operators such as major scooter and bike share companies to provide cities with real-time and historical fleet monitoring, utilization rates, provide support for incident management, and ultimately to provide data-driven insights to city planners so that they can do their jobs more effectively in managing streets. For those of you who aren't familiar with some of the new data sharing requirements that have been put into place, many cities have started to require vehicle counts, for example, for bike and scooter share companies, trip data, maintenance logs, complaints, and injuries. We've seen the evolution of data specifications over the last year, where now cities are starting to request data through standardized formats, which is great. because it makes it much more accessible and more cost efficient for really everyone who's involved in the ecosystem to make use of that data for planning purposes. There are two key data specifications to be aware of. One is GBFS, the General Bike Feed Specification, which was originally developed as a way for docked bike share operators such as Motivate, which was acquired by Lyft last year, to deliver information about where vehicles were located to consumers through their apps, and then to make the data open through APIs to other apps or for other purposes. Towards the end of last year, LADOT introduced what's now known as the Mobility Data Specification, which is much more of a B2G or B2B focused API, and develops and specifies the format in which micromobility operators such as shared bike and scooter share operators should share their data with cities, including notably historical trip GPS trace data and that route data. Finally, many cities also want information on the demographics of who's using these services and mode shift. So they're asking operators to deploy surveys that are consistent and have been rigorously vetted, which is something that the Populous team has pretty significant experience doing over the last decade. So I'm going to now share a couple of examples of how that data is being used. One of the most important areas of analysis that having access to large amounts of GPS-based data from vehicles can allow one to do is to begin conducting more rigorous equity analysis to determine if we're making progress on allocating public space more fairly. The Populous team released a report in November. It's available for download on our website that measures the equitable access to new mobility, specifically dockless bikes and scooters in the Washington, D.C. area. And in it, what you're seeing is we've performed a complex equity analysis by evaluating the average distance to every single bike or scooter for every single street intersection. And what I'm presenting here is a visual of that. We also developed a quantitative equity index for the city. And what we found is that in Ward 8, which is traditionally underserved, you can actually access a dockless e-bike or scooter within a shorter distance than the pre-existing docked bike share system. So this is actually a great win-win. People in underserved neighborhoods, traditionally that were underserved, now have greater access based on this analysis to new mobility solutions that weren't there. And in DC, they've actually increased the vehicle caps for their dockless program from 400 vehicles to 600 vehicles per operator and per vehicle type. So the next example I'm going to share is where cities are now able to access route data. In the past few months, many cities have started to receive this through the Mobility Data Specification. And what's really exciting is that now city transportation planners have access to this wealth of data so they can use it to expand infrastructure for bikes, e-bikes, and e-scooters. I personally think this is one of the most important shifts in the conversation around new mobility, because suddenly we have an unusually large number of constituents in cities demanding better bike lanes, combined with data to back up where those improvements can be made. What you're seeing here are the routes that are being used by dockless bikes and scooters in Arlington County in Virginia. And what you see here is the reclaiming of one parking spot that would most likely have held one parked car for over the course of the day, now being replaced by 15 dockless bike and scooter spots, which we're now measuring through the Populous platform to help evaluate utilization, and then also to help the city communicate where these new parking areas are located back to dockless bike and scooter companies. Now, the final example I'm going to share is really the real opportunity, I think, that we see for cities moving forward with access to this real-time data from shared mobility fleets. And that is dynamic pricing to more efficiently allocate access to public space, including parking for car-sharing vehicles, designing pickup and drop-off zones for fleet vehicles, and then pricing and also incentives for curbs and sidewalks, which many cities are starting to do to get a better handle on managing shared bikes and scooters today, but other vehicles going forward into the future. As cities continue to become more crowded and new mobility services, including eventually autonomous vehicles, are deployed, cities are starting to take more of an active role in managing public space. And they're increasingly able to do that with more and more connected vehicles, whether they're bikes or scooters or cars, and the digital infrastructure to help them manage city streets. So at Populous, we made an announcement towards the end of last year that we're working with Lime, one of the largest micromobility operators, to ingest real-time data from the car sharing service that they launched in November. So this is a free-floating service, similar to the Car2Go example that Don provided earlier, where those vehicles can be parked in different zones. They can be taken from one location and left in a different location, typically using public parking in a city. And through our platform, we're using an industry standard data sharing format, the mobility data specification, to validate the use of public parking spots by those vehicles. Today, virtually every city in the world has fairly static parking policies and pricing, which you're seeing up in the upper right-hand map, and pricing. But you can imagine that with more and more GPS-enabled vehicles and fleet vehicles, whether they are electric scooters or shared electric cars, through a platform like Populous, the city can start developing more dynamic pricing to efficiently manage public curb space and also their actual streets. So we're in the really early stages of cities starting to gain access to real-time information from fleet vehicles, but a really significant amount of progress has been made in 2018. And I'm very excited for this next year and for what the future holds. And we're excited to partner with more mobility operators in cities to help them optimize our transportation system. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Regina and Don. Perfect. And we're going to move now into our Q&A with Regina and Don. So if anyone has any questions, you can type them into the questions panel in the control panel on the right of your screen. We already have a bunch, but feel free to add your typed questions in and we'll start our Q&A. So Regina, since we were just listening to you, a few questions for you. Joshua Scov is wondering, is there a database, someplace of the data requirements by different jurisdictions? Is there one place where folks can find that?
There isn't one single one. There are multiple organizations that have started to track them. We have our own internal tracking. But I believe that one of the conversations that came out of the Transportation Research Board meeting last week and some of the industry-wide conversations is that it would be great to really house that with one entity. And so there are a couple of nonprofit organizations and think tanks that are thinking of taking on that role.
Great. Perfect. Will you write a blog post on our blog when it is available so folks can know about it? I'll put you on the spot.
Yes, we'd be happy to do that.
Thank you. Question from Gabriel Dion for you, Regina. We've seen some scooter companies leaving cities, among other things, with high vandalism of their scooters. Are cities using vandalism data from mobility companies to improve neighborhood safety? Have you seen any correlation there?
I don't know of any examples of cities using vandalism data to improve safety. I know that is a broad issue that I think is a challenge for that industry. And there are a lot of, I think, opportunities in the space for cities and private companies to work collaboratively together. There are campaigns, for instance, now that some of the operators have launched to respect the vehicles and respect the ride. I think that with better coordination between the public sector and the private sector, we'll hopefully see more respect of those vehicles because, you wouldn't see cities stand for the vandalism of other types of fleet vehicles. So why would we expect that to be the case for these new services?
Great. A couple questions. Go ahead, Don.
Can I add that? That's a really interesting question, and I think it has a lot of potential. I think it could also could go awry potentially due to issues of selection bias in the types of neighborhoods that these vehicles would tend to be parked in the first place, and even right down to the micro level decisions that people might make about, well, I'm going to park it on this street and not around the corner because of perceptions of safety. So I think you'd want to be really careful using that data to draw inferences about public safety.
Great. Good point. Couple questions about the webinar being available to view later. Yes, of course, all of our webinars are recorded and they are all available after the webinar, probably tomorrow. And we record them as well as provide the PDFs of the slides, and that's available in the archive section of our website at meetingoftheminds.org on the top right corner. You can find the archive section. So question for both of you as you look at and the work you're doing from David Nees. He's wondering what your guys' thoughts are on the mobility challenges in Europe and how they compare to the U.S. Regina, maybe over to you first. Are you working with any European cities and seeing any differences there?
So we're definitely seeing a lot of new mobility operators growing in Europe. I think that there are a lot of huge differences in investment in public transit infrastructure and in land use and zoning policies. And so you see, generally speaking, in most European cities, much more utilization of transit services and higher regulation of new mobility companies. So it's just a completely different landscape. I think that new mobility services have a role to play, and they have a different role in different types of geographies and under different types of regulatory landscapes.
Great. John?
Yeah, I don't really have much. Yeah, I wish I had more to say on Europe, but I'm pretty ignorant of that.
Yeah, one of our attendees, Luke Knappen, makes the point that in Europe they have GDPR, which doesn't allow collecting data about identifiable individuals without their written consent. Although you guys can both say you've been able to scrape and anonymize the data, correct? Do you think GDPR is an issue?
I think privacy is clearly a big issue in this space, and one of the key distinctions between the type of data that we typically utilize and how it's delivered, and then some of the concerns around personally identifiable information, is that there's actually a lot of information that's attached to our cell phones that I think many people are starting to recognize is being used in ways that people didn't give permission or were aware that their data was being used in those ways. In the case of new mobility services, we're primarily taking data from GPS-enabled vehicles, which is one step removed from a person's individual cell phone, obviously. But there are a number of key steps that need to be taken in order to protect that data. Our main delivery to cities is our aggregations of that data so that one couldn't identify an individual from any of the GPS-based data that we received. And we think that's a really important way for cities to be able to access the data if they don't have the capacity to develop their own internal systems to manage the PII issues.
Yeah, I think this goes back to kind of what I alluded to at the beginning, that, there's a lot of data in these companies, and I don't think that it's necessarily in the public interest for all of that data to go to researchers or public interest organizations or even governments. That I think there's a very reasonable case to be made that only some of that data should need be publicly disclosed. In the case of the specific work we've done, we don't think there's really any way that's identifiable. Again, we have focused to date on the vehicles, or even sort of the system state when you're looking at, waiting times to get an Uber. That's not even particular to a specific vehicle. So in our work, I don't think there's anything identifiable, but you can very easily get into that territory, especially when you start looking at sequences of trips. Even with anonymized user IDs, just looking at sequences of trips, you can start to learn sort of a frightening amount about who that person is. And so it's definitely an area for caution.
Good. Thank you. There's a couple questions that I'll just combine, but I'll make them simple about a city's size. Both of your presentations focus mostly on large cities. Do you think there's a relationship between a city's size and the amount of publicly available mobility data, or are there other factors that are more influential? Regina, first over to you.
Sure. We are seeing that dockless bikes and scooters are now in over 150 markets, some of which are not what you would think of as a major metropolitan area. So what we're seeing is that certain types of fleets are definitely entering from new mobility providers into smaller markets and smaller cities. And those cities are requiring that data be shared. They're starting to use it to design scooter and bike parking, be able to identify lanes that they could improve for more active transportation infrastructure. I think the key challenge is really going to be to what extent are other mobility services such as Uber and Lyft and potentially microtransit really viable in those markets, and will cities be able to access that type of data for monitoring fleets and helping improve their optimization of use of city streets and public space.
Great. Don, any thoughts about city
Yeah.
size and
So
availability?
yeah. So I think the key issue here is there's sort of an issue of market power or the amount of leverage that a local government has. So when you're talking about a very large city, that those cities are in a stronger position to use the right of market access or the privilege of market access as leverage to get companies to disclose data in one form or another. So you see, one of the cities where we have the richest data on ride sourcing services is New York City, because that's such a big market, such an attractive market that companies don't want to be left out of it. When you're a smaller city, you don't have quite the same degree of leverage over these companies to compel them to disclose these data. So that's one observation. The other would be that I think when it comes to analyzing the data, you're going to have, a lot of the effort that goes into this is in cleaning and processing and analyzing data. And those efforts they scale very sublinearly with the size of the data set and the size of the city. So if you're in a smaller city, you're still going to have to do almost as much work as you would in a very large city to run the same analysis. And so I think this is another area where working with outside partners, working with third-party platforms that can store, archive, potentially clean, and provide a means of analysis for this data is beneficial, especially to smaller cities, because so many of these costs of data acquisition and cleaning and analysis are essentially fixed costs. They don't really depend on how large your city is. But that makes it harder as a smaller city to bring the resources to bear on these.
Great. And a kind of a follow-up question from Tara Pham. What are important data sets that you feel are still missing? Don, over to you first.
Oh, that's hard. I think one of the things that is most valuable is having greater access to trip origin and destination data. Again, you can always learn more if you have sequences of trips made by individual travelers, but I think that you get into the realm of diminishing returns. I think getting trip level data is pretty important. I think even though right now, there's a lot we can do with API data, but we're not permitted to. So even data that are sort of technically available, but there are restrictions on use. So in a sense, these are more policy barriers than they are even technical barriers. It's more about what you're allowed to do with the data than even the data being available. But again, API data can give you a lot. They can't give you everything that you'd want. We're working right now with some partners up at UBC in Vancouver, looking at ways that we can, again, make further use of this sort of semi-public API data to understand impacts on accessibility. So how have the introduction of these new services improved the ability to people to get to destinations, kind of like what Regina showed for DC there with the dockless bike shares, taking that but also accounting for the existing options that are already available into kind of a composite measure of how easy or hard it is to get places.
Great. Regina, anything to add about important data sets you feel are still missing?
Yeah, well, there are, increasingly more and more data that's being made available. I think that we've seen a lot of exciting progress, but there are a lot of challenges in understanding how new mobility services impact people's behavior, both short and long range decisions. So people often like to discount survey data, travel surveys that are typically conducted once every 10 years, but they're really important because sometimes you just fundamentally have to ask people about their transportation decisions, why they are choosing to own or not own an automobile, how they're making substitutions between public transit or driving their own car and a new mobility solution that might be available. And so that's one of the things that we do is collect that type of survey data to make it available to cities. But there are an infinite number of data needs that I could go on and on about, but I'll stop with that one example.
Great. Thanks, you guys. This is for you, Don. Joshua Scov is asking, how do you explain the longer wait times in wealthier areas? Is that because of lack of density? Wealthier areas are less dense?
Yeah, so this is, So this is interesting, right? This kind of can tie back into Regina's last point that sometimes, you need to go and do surveys, and I'd say that, the data we can get from APIs is really good for kind of monitoring system state and high level performance of the system. It's really poor for explaining and understanding individual behaviors. So, the link to the question that was just asked, how do we explain the longer wait times in wealthier areas? We can't really with this data. So what we would need to do is we need to generate some hypotheses and go and test those, and we probably wouldn't, we may not be able to get at that with just this data that's available, right? So some hypotheses might be that wealthier neighborhoods have a more, suburban road network design, more cul-de-sacs. So it could have to do with the nature of the road network in those areas. It could have to do with higher car ownership in those areas, so there's less demand for ride-hailing services in those areas. So people aren't using ride sourcing because they have personal cars at their disposal. We don't really know, right? So there could be other variables that are correlated with the neighborhood income that we've not captured. And so that's a limitation of this work. But, we were mostly interested in kind of approaching this from a diagnostic perspective, right? So step one is sort of ask, is there an issue here, right? So we'd be concerned if neighborhoods are being inequitably served, particularly if neighborhoods that have fewer options available to them are being underserved. So the idea here is we can kind of approach this in a diagnostic way, and that's sort of step one, and that's what we got at with that analysis. We don't really know why that's happening, though.
Great. Anything to add, Regina, about density, wealthy areas, wait times, etc.?
I think that Dawn pretty much covered it, but I've found in just adoption rates of new mobility services and the frequency at which people use them, you do find that lots of upper income individuals use them, but if they do live in suburban neighborhoods, they tend to not use them frequently because they probably own a car and because the wait times are probably fairly long due to the relationship between supply and demand in those types of geographies.
Great. Let's move on to a question about equity. Richard Beckwith asking first to you, Regina, what's the most exciting equity-oriented service you've seen come out of this data, or how has the data informed better services with an equity, goal?
I think the work that we did in the DC area, in which we've built out tools to help cities kind of understand and monitor and manage access to dockless bike and scooter share, is really exciting. Historically, most cities that were able to afford to bring bike share typically did so with public funding to install docked bike share systems. And you can, look in the literature and see what some of the challenges were related to providing equitable access using the publicly funded systems. I think there's a huge role for those systems to play. The reliability of knowing that a bike is at a particular location is very important. But the influx of dockless is really exciting because they're more flexible systems, and you're able to place more vehicles in neighborhoods that maybe weren't able to access those previously established systems. And we've shown that with data, and thanks to the access to large amounts of GPS vehicle data, we've been able to show just how much more accessible some of those services are, even sometimes with a smaller number of vehicles.
Great. John, anything?
Yeah, I would add, I don't have like a study at top of mind that has looked at this, but I do think that, again, this is an example of why we need access to these sorts of data, because there are many different ways you could frame this question, right? So is it about trips being made, if you want to take the example of scooter share, just for the sake of argument, right? Are there scooter share trips being made to or from underserved neighborhoods, maybe low-income neighborhoods? Maybe yes, maybe no. That's one measure of equity. But another measure of equity is, are there scooters available in that neighborhood? And so, it is valuable to have access to this data so you can kind of approach this question in a variety of ways and understand kind of, even if trips aren't being made, is the opportunity there, right, for people? Or are trips not being made because there's an inadequate supply of vehicles? Additionally, in Seattle here, with our dockless bike share pilot, they had some rules written for equity, but they mostly related to having to have a certain number of bikes in underserved zones of the city. But beyond that, there was no requirement about the distribution of the bikes within that zone. But you can well imagine that it's very different to have, 50 bikes on, at one point in a zone versus, distributed throughout the area. Because, when you talk about even a 5-minute walk to access one of these things, that's a non-trivial impact. So the utility of these can be greatly increased by having these things very much distributed out right to where people want them. And you can't really get at that with some of the higher level statistics that would be reported. And you run the risk that, if a policy is written in a certain way, it incentivizes, it may incentivize, behaviors on the part of companies that are not totally aligned with the objectives. And so that's not because the companies are bad. It's that they're trying to make money, and that if you put a policy in place, it may incentivize certain things, and it may not be exactly what you want. But we don't really know that if we don't have access to the data, and we can't suggest better approaches, again, if we don't have access to the data.
Right. Great. Good. And Regina, this question's for you. Pivoting a little bit. What's the main value proposition that you pitch to cities to sell them on Populous? Is equity a big enough concern for them, or is there a more financial efficiency incentive that takes the lead? What are you seeing with all the cities you're working with?
Well, I think Dawn kind of touched on one of the key issues earlier, which is that many cities want access to better data from mobility operators in order to plan their infrastructure so that it is more efficient for everyone on the roads and safer as well. But there's a huge amount of work that's involved in cleaning these data feeds. No data feed is clean or easy to use. And so 90% of the work that's involved typically in using this type of data is the cleaning and processing and harmonizing of it in order to deliver it in a useful format to make decisions and to inform decisions. So that's really the key value. Most cities, particularly of a certain size and below, just don't have the engineering and data science resources. We're doing this for cities across the U.S. and soon across the globe, and so we can do it more efficiently at a lower cost than a city could do on their own in most cases.
Great. Dawn, any thoughts about what motivates cities to hire someone like Regina or give you a grant to do it for them? What's their incentive? Oh, did we lose Dawn? Can't hear you, Dawn.
Good call. Thank you. Yeah.
There you are.
Yeah, no, I'm back. Sorry, I had muted. So I think I think really the key is, like Regina said, it's the leveraging the work that's already been done by others, especially if you're sort of a smaller jurisdiction. A lot of the analytical effort is common across all these different jurisdictions, so there's a way to kind of benefit from the work that's already been done.
Great. This question's for you, Dawn. Seattle has improved their transit in recent years. They're also the only city in the country that's on increase in transit ridership, as we all know now. So do you think using data from some other city would show a greater difference in time difference between car share and transit?
I have no idea. I will say that this was a strictly cross-sectional analysis. We were really only looking at a single slice in time, so we didn't really get at that. How have things changed over time? I think that's an excellent question, and I would encourage others to do it. The challenge being that our API access was pulled. We contacted Car2Go. They said they no longer issue API keys for researchers. And so again, this is sort of the tenuous nature of trying to use these existing resources and existing data sets under sort of the current set of rules that we have. Companies can withdraw that and they decide it's no longer in their interest to share that, and then we're kind of out in the cold. So it is a question I would hope others would ask. I will say that Francis Spry at Chalmers University in Sweden has done some work comparing across a bunch of different cities in Europe, looking at Car2Go data. I don't know if they've done the transit comparison yet, but they have a large data set from a number of different cities there.
Great. And let's get back to your presentation. There were a bunch of questions that had come in. I think Edward Clock-McCook phrased it most simply, which is, did I understand correctly that your conclusion is that a 44 to 65% time savings Car2Go versus transit is not significant? There was some confusion there from a few folks.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's not that. No, I would call that savings huge. Order of half the time. The difference I was saying is not significant is when we look at the time savings, when we look at the time savings that Car2Go offered on trips that were made by Car2Go, and then when we look at the time savings that Car2Go would have offered on trips that were actually made by transit. So trips that were actually made by Car2Go versus trips that were actually made by transit, the time savings that Car2Go offers is essentially the same in those two cases. So if Car2Go were being used, for cases where transit is a really bad option, we would have expected to see a bigger time savings on those actual Car2Go the trips that were actually made by Car2Go. Does that help?
Step in, John, and clarify? So are you saying that people are making the decision based on some other factor potentially besides just time savings?
It does. Well, it may be that it's driven by time savings, but it doesn't appear that it's accruing specifically to routes where the Car2Go time savings is disproportionately large. I'm sure that the time savings is a part of it, but that's not all that there is to it.
So there are people who are making the trips by transit anyway, even though the Car2Go savings would be significant.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and I don't have the numbers, but what did I say? We had about 270 or 300,000 trips over a 2-month period. I mean, that's a small fraction of all the transit trips in our region over a 2-month period.
Okay, great. Okay, I think that clarifies. Hopefully Christina or Josh, Edward, and a couple others who had questions about that or feel like they got their answer. Great. And well, I guess this is so there's a question about tracking shared bikes and scooters. Maybe first over to you, Regina. Their shared bikes and scooters are often a public nuisance because they're dumped on sidewalks and clutter up public spaces. We've all seen all the photos and the articles. So besides vandalism data, what other information can cities use to track and improve that situation? What are you seeing? How are cities using the data, working with you to create better sidewalks, essentially?
So we're actually taking the vehicle locations for stationary bikes and scooters. We also have trip data, but for the stationary bikes and scooters, we are now clustering them so that cities know where predominantly they're being placed and left so they can start designing bike and scooter corrals like the one we showed in Arlington. And so that's one way for cities and operators to really work together to help manage those types of systems. I will also comment on, the question of do they cause clutter, visual clutter? We've actually assessed people's attitudes towards dockless bikes and scooters in major metros. And for the most part, yes, there are a certain portion of people who have that view, but they're actually in the minority. So people who are, frustrated by seeing dockless bikes and scooters are a relatively small percentage of people compared to an overwhelming number of people who actually think that they are a great addition to the transportation ecosystem, that are starting to use them instead of driving a personal vehicle or using an Uber or Lyft, and that think they're fun to ride. So I think that assessing, the actual attitudes of people in a population can help policymakers make more informed decisions. It's really easy to, make decisions based on the people who complain the loudest, but sometimes it's useful to have good representative data based on polling.
Yeah, I would say we're working up an idea right now to study this in more detail to understand, what exactly is it that rubs people the wrong way about this, and is it just an issue of when they're blocking the sidewalk, or is it an objection to their presence in the public right of way more broadly? Does it have to do with where they're left, how many there are? The fact that sometimes they can be kind of disorderly. So there's a whole bunch of hypotheses we have about what is it that really kind of grates on people aesthetically, and so we think we're quite sure that can be fixed while maintaining the benefits that these offer in terms of accessibility. And certainly, right, there's a question here of, when these things are dumped blocking the sidewalk and someone has to step over it, or worse yet, someone in a wheelchair, for instance, can't get by. That's a real issue, and that's something that I think that absolutely local governments need to hold companies to account for, and the companies need to hold their customers to account for, to deal with that bad behavior.
Great. Thanks, you too. And I guess a question, Regina, in the survey may be about, are people willing to put up with it in order to have less congestion on the roads, right? Or traffic fights or parking fights, et cetera. Okay, so we are at the top of the hour. So many questions we didn't get to. We will share your questions with Regina and Dawn. Feel free to reach out to them at their email if something really, really pressing that you didn't feel like we got to in time. Their emails are available on this slide, hello@populous.ai and dwhm@uw.edu for Dawn. So we are at the top of the hour, so a short survey will pop up once you close your browser. We really appreciate your feedback, and we hope to see you at next month's webinar on February 6th, which will tackle behavior changes, technology, and public-private partnerships to improve urban congestion, to somewhat build on today's topic. You can see the event on the events section of our website at meetingtheminds.org. So that concludes our session for today, and have a great day, and thanks again for everyone for attending, and big thanks to Regina and Dawn. Thank you so much, you two, for your time and effort and prep to do this very large webinar today. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Bye, everybody. Have a great day.